Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got William Pellerin with us today. He is an international trade lawyer, partner of McMillan LLP. He is working on the front lines of what companies are doing in regards to dealing with these threatened Trump tariffs. And so I thought it would be interesting. We've talked to economists, we've talked to politicians about what the heck is going on. But, I thought it'd be interesting to chat with someone who is actually dealing with businesses and what they're doing. William Pellerin, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brian. Happy to be here.
So tell me, what are businesses doing? They're calling you up and saying, should we move to the States, or should we start a litigation, or what do we do?
Yeah, at this point, it's more about trying to keep the business going and the relationships going and trying to figure out exactly what this is going to mean for the bottom line. And the first thing is who's going to pay if a tariff goes in place as between Canada and the United States? And what does that mean for my existing contracts? Do I have to break these long-standing relationships that have been very good for companies on both sides of the border? So we represent American companies and Canadian companies, and everyone's just trying to, first of all, figure out exactly what this means and who has to pay. And that's generally quite a surprising question because no one's ever thought about what would happen if a tariff actually arose as between Canada and the United States. We're really in a newfound territory here for a lot of businesses.
So I've been negotiating two construction contracts recently, and at the last minute last week, both contractors, general contractors, inserted a clause saying that I'm responsible as the developer for any increase in tariffs. It was interesting because it was a section that said that I was responsible for any increased taxes, and they just added in and tariffs. So I guess I am. And if I am, I'm going to pass it on to the consumer. And so in the end, don't the consumers pay?
That's absolutely right. I mean, ultimately, in the vast majority of cases, consumers end up paying more when a tariff is imposed. That's fundamentally an importer by law is the party that has to pay the tariff at the border. And then contracts, of course, can assign that responsibility to either party. And it all comes down to bargaining power, right? So if a company has a lot of bargaining power, people want their products, people are going to buy their products no matter how much, if it costs 25% more, then ultimately that company can push that to the consumer. You're absolutely right, to the end user. The issue is that that's not sometimes the case, and that's not what we're seeing across the board, right? There are some companies where the consumer will not pay more, or the end purchaser of that product will not pay more, and they'll find other sources of product other than the Canadian product or the US product. They'll buy from China, they'll buy from Vietnam, and they're just going to find alternative sources of supply where they don't have to pay that tariff.
So, lots of Canadian companies sell into the United States, and there's this concept that someone told me about called FOB, free on board. And they said it depends on whether the contract was FOB, the factory in Canada, the border, or the place of delivery in the United States. Does that play a part?
Absolutely. So what you're referring to are Incoterms. So every contract, or the vast majority of contracts, have these three-letter words called Incoterms built in. These are standardized global shipping terms that everyone understands in the kind of business world when you're dealing with duties and the like. And so one of those Incoterms, as you properly pointed out, is FOB. And that's normally a delivery term that is quite friendly to the buyer. So that's normally used when delivery is, let's say a Canadian company is shipping to the United States. The risk and the costs will transfer in Canada. So the buyer, the US buyer, will have to ship the goods to the United States. The US buyer will be the one declaring the goods at the border and so on. Then there's the complete opposite end of the spectrum called DDP, where that delivery term stands for delivered duties paid. So if you have a contract that is DDP and you're shipping a product to the United States, you're the one that is responsible for paying the duties at the US border because you're delivering that product to your end customer with the duties paid. So there are actually 11 different Incoterms that range from very friendly to the seller all the way to very friendly to the buyer. And understanding exactly what the contracts say is very, very important. And then we get into the whole question of how do we mitigate the problem of additional tariffs? But the number one thing is absolutely understanding what your contracts and understanding those Incoterms.
So if I've got this shipping term, this Incoterm, where I have to deliver it to the customer in the United States, duties paid, isn't the exporter then, the Canadian company then, paying the duty, paying the increased tariff?
So that's right. In that case, the Canadian exporter would also be the US importer. So you would be a non-resident importer in the United States. So your Canadian businesses that exports would also be a US importer as a non-resident importer. So this is why this is what I'm saying. There's an infinite different permutations that exist.
So that the difference here is the U.S. importer you're saying is the one that pays, but the U.S. importer could be a Canadian company.
Correct. Correct.
So that's interesting. So who's this tariff going to hurt? It's going to hurt both people.
Correct. So ultimately, what a tariff does is increase prices, right? It increases prices on one of the parties, and that party will often seek to recoup the amount that has to be paid, right? Ultimately, you can't afford to just increase your cost by 25% without passing that on to somebody. That's too high. So either you'll try to cost share with the other party that you're contracting with, or if it's a product that you resell, say you're an importer of furniture in the United States and you're purchasing furniture from Canada. Well, as between the Canadian furniture manufacturer, the US distributor or company, and the end customer, someone's going to pay. And it might be a little bit for each person along the chain, but ultimately, no one's going to try to absorb that and just eat that cost. It's too high and it'll drive you out of business.
So what are your clients doing?
Yeah, it's absolutely a mix. So in some cases, it's trying to figure out, okay, can we renegotiate? Can we cost share? Can we come up with some sort of arrangement where we each pay a portion of the duties? In some cases where the other side has a lot more power, right? Where they're, let's say, a very big established buyer that can effectively push me to just eat the cost. In that case, people are saying, well, we're going to have to cancel this contract. We can't afford to pay 25% more. And so we're triggering termination clauses. We're getting ready to terminate contracts or just trying desperately to avoid them. So there are things in contracts called force majeure clauses, where if there is some sort of extraordinary event, acts of God and the like, floods, sometimes you can trigger those clauses to get out of contracts. So we're looking at those types of contract
So do you
clauses.
think, a Trump imposed tariffs that he's been talking about for numerous months that obviously almost came to pass last week and was given a 30-day reprieve, is that a force majeure?
It really depends on the language of each contract. So there's no standard force majeure clauses. I will say that in the majority of cases, we're not seeing it, where a tariff would not be a force majeure is what typical contracts say. But there might be other clauses like change of laws clauses in a contract that allow you to renegotiate when you do actually have a material change in the laws of one of the country that affects the parties.
So give me let me give you this example of Canadian developer building a building in Canada, has a contract with a general contractor, and the general contractor says you've got to take the tariffs, but the developer can't afford to take and eat a 25% tariff. And so what does the developer do? Say force majeure, I don't want to go ahead, or you got to go look elsewhere?
Yeah. So if you can get out of it and you want to get out of it because you can't afford it, then you would look at all the different clauses in your contracts, including force majeure. Maybe that works, maybe it doesn't. Maybe you have a change of laws contracts that allows you to renegotiate. You'd look at that. And then ultimately it would come down to a decision. Can you use something that already exists in the contract? And if not, if you're stuck contractually, well, maybe there's still renegotiation to happen on the contract where you go to the other side and you say, listen, we can't afford this. We're going to have to break this contract, even if we're not allowed to do it. We can't go out of business. And so then it becomes reopening the contract, adding new terms, and trying to share that additional cost. And that's where we're going to start seeing a lot of litigation in the coming months, where people are going to get out of contracts because they can't afford them anymore. But they're not allowed to break those contracts. And so it's
The
going to
other
cost them.
answer that I got was let's sign real quick so we can order the goods before the end of February and this 30-day clock terminates. And or we got to scramble and look whether we can get some of this product from elsewhere in the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think that there are absolutely goods where you can stock inventory in the other country, and you might be able to bring a lot of goods across the border that satisfies you for a few months. There are other industries where that's not possible, where something is made to measure, or a machine or equipment that is specifically made on order by a customer, right? So these kind of big one-off industrial pieces simply can't be prepped in advance and shipped in advance. So again, it really depends on the industry. It depends on, we're seeing things that are very commercial type products, right? Couches and furniture or the like, big industrial equipment on one end, commodities on the other, right? If you're talking about grains or canola or anything of the sort, very different dynamics at play, depending on those industries, and depending, frankly, on if there are other buyers out there in the world, right? So if you make if you produce agricultural commodities in Canada, call it pork bellies or wheat or something of the sort, you'll find other buyers globally for that product if the US is going to slap a tariff on it in the majority of cases. Prices might be slightly different, but you'll probably be okay to find additional buyers. If you make a semi-luxury type product in Canada that is sold to the US consumer, which is a high buying power consumer, you're not going to find an alternative buyer for that product very easily, right? Especially if it's something that's heavy that doesn't ship well. The U.S. consumer is still king globally, and the Chinese consumer is not going to be picking up Canadian furniture, right? That we're not gonna start shipping furniture to China to the Chinese consumer to replace the U.S. consumer. It's not going to happen.
So this is going to be pretty disruptive to Canadian business. You're probably getting a lot of calls every day.
Absolutely. Sorry. We're absolutely seeing a large number of calls. The flow of questions is really unabated, and it really is these questions of what's the status for my business? What does this mean? But then the other piece is, can you help us? What can we do? And that's where it gets really interesting, where we're finally trying to put in place some strategies for customers. And it's not just breaking contracts. There are a number of things that you can do to mitigate the hurt on this, including coming up with some really advanced level kind of strategies to reduce the value of the goods to which the tariff applies, and so on. So, and then, of course, if you're an importer in Canada, making sure that you're trying to get your product off or on the retaliation list, right? That's also very important, and is a big piece of this puzzle.
This is
So,
going to be a fascinating conversation today. We've got an expert in international trade from McMillan, William Pellerin, with us today, talking about Trump tariffs and what Canadian companies are doing. We're going to take a break for some messages. We'll be back in just 2 minutes with William. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We've got William Pellerin. He's a international trade lawyer with McMillan with us today. He says he's getting a whole bunch of calls from Canadian companies worried about what's going to happen, what could have happened a week ago, what might happen in a month in regards to threatened tariffs and retaliatory tariffs. So, William, you said there's a bunch of strategies that people could employ. Let's talk about some of that. But before we get really into the detail of some of those, I want to ask you about the role that currency plays. So, and you said off the top you're not an economist, and so you may not get into some of the economic details. But let me see if I can ask you about some of them. So someone told me that the energy issue is less of an issue because Canadian energy companies typically contract to sell oil and gas in U.S. dollars. And so therefore, if a tariff goes in, what will happen is the Canadian dollar will go down, the U.S. dollar will go up. And so therefore the amount of money that the Canadian energy providers receive in US dollars is the same, but in Canadian dollars has gone up because the US dollar is appreciated versus the Canadian dollar. Is that true?
I think it's absolutely a possibility. I've heard the same, and we're talking to some clients that think that currency shifts are going to mitigate some of the harm. But I think at least what I'm hearing from our clients is they're very worried that won't be a one for one proposition, right? Like that the fact that the currency might devalue on the Canadian side might help mitigate the extent of the damage, but it's by no means a panacea. So it really, I think, depends again on the companies, on the industry, and it really will depend on how much the Canadian dollar drops further in respect.
So a
And
lot of
that's
Canadian
for those
companies,
companies. Yeah.
sorry, I
Sorry, I was just
apologize.
going to say.
Go
Go
ahead.
ahead. I was just going to say, and that works to some degree, perhaps for the companies that are shipping and have everything denominated in U.S. dollars. But the vast majority, or a large number of businesses, aren't necessarily shipping in U.S. dollars, or they're not necessarily hedged properly with respect to movement of commodities, movement of currencies. Sorry.
So this is interesting because, I think a lot of Canadian companies, because their expenses are in Canadian dollars, want to transact and sell in Canadian dollars, and or, as you say, they hedge their U.S. dollar exposure. But I was told that that's actually, in this case, a bad strategy, that what you really want to do is contract in U.S. dollars, because if you think the tariffs are going to be imposed and it's going to be bad for the Canadian economy, then the US dollar is going to appreciate, the Canadian dollar is going to depreciate. And so therefore, you're going to get more money, which will allow you to withstand that tariff to a greater degree. And the opposite side is if you are selling in Canadian dollars and the Canadian dollar goes down, you're going to get a double whammy. That number one, you're going to have to pay the tariff, and number two, you're actually selling the product for less value on a world basis, world currency basis. And so therefore, I got to ask you the question: as you're talking to people, what are you advising them? Sell in Canadian dollars or sell in US dollars?
Yeah, that one there is less of a legal strategy and far more of an economic one. We do talk about that with clients, or hear some of our clients saying, okay, we're going to be less exposed because we're transacting in US dollars, or in some cases, we're going to be more exposed because we're transacting in Canadian dollars. Honestly, that discussion, at least with us on the legal side, we're not getting into the weeds of. And I think that ultimately, while that's a very interesting proposition, ultimately there's still going to be pain, and that movement in the currency, at least from what we're hearing, will not offset the full impact of a 25% tariff. That's just too high, and the currency movement will not make companies whole. At least that's what we're hearing. I'm not in cons. I haven't done the math, but it would take a massive movement in currency to offset 25% tariff.
Yeah. So the former governor of the Bank of Canada, was on TV just a couple of days ago and said that he thought that the currency movements might impact a third to a half of the movement. So I think you're probably right that it's not going to offset the whole amount. But it is interesting, I think, that historically you always wanted to sort of hedge your bets, and so therefore sell in Canadian dollars and or hedge. Today, maybe what you want is exposure to the US dollar, which is kind of a different analysis than what you've done in the past as a company and as a trader. So you mentioned that companies are thinking about other strategies. What kind of other strategies are companies pursuing right now?
Yeah, I think the big one is understanding the value for duty. And so to take a step back, people have always used, or traditionally, when you ship to the United States or you import from the United States into Canada, the value that you declare at the border for your goods is often the invoice price that you commercially transact on. But so that's the value on which that 25% tariff will apply. Well, lo and behold, you don't always need to use that invoice price as your value for duty at the border, right? People have never really thought about that underlying piece, But let's say you declare your goods at the border for $100. Well, your tariff will be 25% of that, $25, right? If you can change that underlying value of the duty and get it down to $50 in a legal way that passes muster with the authorities, then that 25% hits a lot less hard. And there are strategies that are legal that relate to transfer pricing between companies or properly declaring that value for duty that gets it down. People have not been thinking about this because when the tariff rate was 0%, no one really cared about what the value of the good that you were declaring at the border was, right? It didn't matter. Like if you declare $1,000, if it's 0%, it doesn't matter what the underlying value was. But that underlying value becomes so much more important when you're talking about a 25% tariff. So there's a lot of legal games that can be played to make sure that you're declaring the proper value of the goods at the border to get that total duties down significantly.
That's interesting. So what are some of the things that you can do to do that? If intellectual property is owned in the United States, for Ford or GM or Chrysler or something like that, can they transfer the goods from Canada to the United States at a very low value and book the increased profit in the United States?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. There's a number of different strategies from very simple low-hanging fruit all the way to the most complicated stuff. So the low-hanging fruit is a value for duty is supposed to be the value of the goods at the point of shipment, when it leaves the factory. Let's say Canada ships, I don't know, a widget from Winnipeg down to Chicago. That widget should be valued at the factory gate in Winnipeg, right? So it should remove any type of freight. The freight should not be included. Sometimes people have been including freight into their value for duty. That's a bad move, right? Get that out of there. Get that number as low as possible to pay less duties. Then there's services. Sometimes you will bundle your price and it'll include a bunch of services also, because you might be helping assemble the product upon arrival in the United States. That should not be included into your value for duty. You want only the goods, removing any type of assistance post-shipment. So that's the low-hanging fruit, easy stuff. Get that number as low as possible. Make sure it's only the good when it's leaving the factory. Then there's the more advanced stuff, as you're mentioning, which are related party sales, where you move some of your selling and general administrative expenses into the foreign country, incur the costs there so that you have that first sale price as between Canada and the United States as low as possible. And then you might have a resale price in the country of export that is higher to your end customer, but that price won't be the one that you declare at the border. So that's the key, is getting that number down, the value of that product as low as possible so that you pay less tariffs, even if the tariff rate doesn't change.
What if your product includes, Chinese raw materials or American raw materials, or it's a car that goes back and forth across the border several times? Is it the total amount that you're selling that assembled car for, or is it only the Canadian content portion of that product?
Yeah, so it's the total amount. So what matters is the origin of the product, the identity of the product that you're shipping once that product comes together, right? So if you're selling multiple different products and one of them's Chinese and one of them's Canadian and they're all kind of separate pieces and they're different products, then you would only pay tariffs on the Canadian one. But if you've actually assembled, Chinese steel and Indian screws and Taiwanese other parts into a Canadian thing that you manufactured in Canada, the identity of that manufactured product, according to the rules of origin that govern all of this, would probably be Canadian, and you would pay a tariff on it.
That makes no sense. So let me ask you a question. So, both Canada and the United States have put on 100% tariff on Chinese EV cars, electronic vehicles. Why don't we just get rid of that tariff, buy a whole bunch of Chinese cars, slap a Canadian made in Canada thing on it, and sell it to the United States at a 25% tariff, and screw the Americans out of 75% of their tariff?
So it really comes down. So if Canada was importing Chinese product and selling it to the United States, that product would still be Chinese. So it's
You
not.
told me that it's on the total invoice. All I have to do is put a Canadian top
No,
hat on
you
it.
yeah, you have to actually manufacture the product, right? Those rules of origin are not, it goes to the origin of the product, the identity of the product. That's the key. So in a situation like that, the Chinese product, it would be a Chinese identity because the product was made in China. The fact that it transits through or comes into Canada or maybe even gets just a pair of wheels slapped onto it wouldn't count to turn that Chinese product into a Canadian product. So these rules of origin, how the goods lose their identity and become the identity of another country are very, very important. Sometimes they're extremely complicated, especially around automotive products.
Okay, so
But
come
the
back to
key, yeah,
the typical Ford or GM that goes across the border 6 times. Um, when it's ultimately sold from Canada to the United States, is it sold at the total invoice price and duty applied, or is it only on, is it still an American vehicle?
yeah. So if it's the full product that goes, like if a finished car is leaving the Chrysler facility in Canada and going to the United States, it would be the value of that full car that is made in Canada. If that car has a Canadian identity, Canadian rule of origin, then it would be subject to the tariffs. If it's a car seat or different that are moving, right, from car parts made in Ontario moving to Ohio, then it would be that car seat if it's Canadian. Now, sometimes what we do see is different parts move from the United States to Canada. They might do a little bit of work on it, might tighten a few bolts, slap a few other things on it, and move it back to the United States. In that case, that product might still have US identity, right? The work that might have been done in Canada might not have been enough to change the origin of that good. And so that's the key is understanding when a product loses its identity of one country and gains the identity of the other. If you're simply, tightening a few screws on a product, it's still going to be, in the vast majority of cases, the identity of the other product. So take a car seat that's made in Ohio, comes to Ontario, and Ontario puts a cover on it, let's say, and then moves that product back to Ohio. That product might not be subject to duties because in that case it might not have been sufficiently transformed to meet the new rule of origin, and so it's still a US product.
And is this a an economic calculation or a value add calculation or an hour's work calculation or a what?
Yeah, so every product has a different rule of origin, so that's what I'm talking about. It's very, very difficult.
No,
So
this
in
is going to
some
be great
cases,
for you guys lawyers. Like you're going to be employed like crazy trying to figure out rule of origin.
there are tons of lawyers that do a lot of rule of origin work. This is true. There are lots of consultants that specialize exclusively in the rules of origin because it can be very, very complicated. So to answer your question, sometimes it's a value add proposition. So we often see many of the rules say it's where 60% of the value of the product comes from. So if 60% comes from Canada, then it becomes Canadian. In other cases, it's when the classification of the good changes. So if let's take a pile of wood with a piece of leather and the like, and so that leather and that wood, separate products, they come into Canada, they become a piece of furniture. The classification changes. Now it's become furniture in Canada because it was made into furniture. If that goes into the United States, it is no longer, the leather and the wood, it's the furniture. So now that product is Canadian because it changed classifications, it changed names, right, as to how these goods are classified by the customs authorities.
Lots of companies had housed their intellectual property in Ireland or Luxembourg or Barbados or Bahamas or Bermuda or something like that. And so therefore they're transferring their goods at one price, but the royalties on the intellectual property are going somewhere else. Is that a smart strategy?
Yeah, so in some cases the movement of royalties and the value of the good with respect to the intellectual property that's an extremely complicated type question. But in theory, that value of that good and how you're evaluating it shouldn't include, in many cases, that extra piece that you're selling. So if you're selling an intellectual property right, the way that influences the price, right? When I was talking earlier about the factory gate for that product, when it leaves the factory, how much is that worth as a product? Might not need to include that additional piece that you're selling in terms of that intellectual property value. So you really want to understand those rules specifically, and we have some folks at the firm that know those rules. And with respect to intellectual property, that's outside of my core expertise. So I turn it over to those experts pretty darn quick.
We're chatting tonight with William Pellerin, who is an international trade lawyer at McMillan, who's been inundated probably with calls from different companies. What the heck are we going to do about these Trump tariffs? And so I thought it'd be really helpful to chat with him about what companies are doing and what we can do to insulate ourselves. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with William in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're talking international trade, the threat of Trump tariffs with international trade lawyer and expert William Pellerin, who is a lawyer with McMillan, and he's been chatting with us about what companies are doing. You know, I think one of the other things, William, if I could, is that what Canada should do, and there's been a whole bunch of conversations of late about frankly, we should be selling east-west in Canada without tariff barriers. And I heard this one report that the interprovincial trade barriers in Canada are equivalent to effectively a 25% trade barrier, and that if we got rid of them, we'd have a 4 to 6% increase in Canadian GDP. You know, are any of those numbers approximately right? Why? What are those barriers, and why the heck do we have them?
Yeah, I've heard a number of different economists with different numbers on the value or the pain to the Canadian economy of having these barriers. I think you're absolutely right. I think Canadians would often be shocked to understand that the free trade agreement as between the Canadian provinces is often less permissive than the free trade agreements we have with other countries. So in many cases, it's actually easier to ship or collaborate or deal with foreign countries than it is to deal within Canada. I think it goes to, you know, why does this happen? How did this happen? It goes to the Constitution and how Canada is a federation of different provinces that have a lot of different powers under the Constitution. But nonetheless, I think there is a time, and that time is probably now, to remove a lot of these barriers and understand that if we can't sell to the United States in the same way, we need to find a way to come together as a country, tear down some of those barriers, and really allow Canadian businesses to expand from coast to coast.
Can you give us an example of what some of those barriers might be? You know, I've heard about, you know, wine as one barrier, and then you know, the movement of labor and teachers and teacher certifications is another barrier. What are some of these interprovincial trade barriers we got to get rid of?
Yeah, so mutual recognition of goods and services as between the provinces is absolutely key. And some of these are shocking, frankly. The one that comes to mind as the obvious example is emergency first aid kits. Emergency first aid kit regulations are different across the province. If you produce a first aid kit in one province, you cannot necessarily sell that in other provinces. The rules are different. Well, lo and behold, you know, without being an expert in emergency first aid kits, if one province is certified that those kits are sufficient and meet the requirements, we should probably be able to recognize that certification in the other provinces. So that's, you know, one of those things that just can't be sold across the province because each province has different rules. So, you know, streamlining those types of issues would allow companies to ship their product, cut the bureaucracy, cut the red tape, and just allow businesses to continue growing and selling.
It
So
sounds like
yeah.
it's a slam dunk solution. Why hasn't it been implemented already?
I think each province thinks that they're unique or special or needs to have special rules, or often just aren't thinking this way, right? I'll use the example of the emergency first aid kits again, just for now, although there are many, many different examples. But the people in each provinces that are responsible for these might be, the health and safety folks. They're not thinking about international, interprovincial trade. They're not thinking about the burden on businesses. So they're thinking about their products like, in our province, here's what we need, and that's what it's going to take if you want to sell that product here. Well, maybe, putting a business mindset on that also and saying, you know, you're right, maybe there's a 1% difference, but ultimately, if we tear that down, you'll be entirely fine with the test kit that's certified in Ontario or the emergency first aid kit that's certified by Ontario. And maybe, Nova Scotia doesn't need its own requirements, right? So
Well, I heard that car seats have different requirements for the ingredients, materials in a car seat in Quebec versus Ontario, and so it's easier to trade a car seat with the United States than it is between Ontario and Quebec. So some of these rules have got to change. I got to ask you, one of the other solutions people have talked about is increased free trade with Europe. And yet, the comment coming back was that then we'd have to open up our dairy marketing boards that we've protected. And that's one of the biggest complaints, both from the United States as well as Europe. Can you explain what the dairy marketing board restriction is?
Yeah, absolutely. So Canada has a very unique globally system for dealing with dairy products, and it's a system called supply management. And what that means is that the amount of dairy products that you can produce in this country are limited by quota. So if you can't tomorrow morning buy some cows and start producing milk and selling milk in this country, you need to buy quota, and they will tell you how much milk you can produce. As well, prices are also fixed. And all of this system is to ensure that dairy farmers in Canada can make a good living, right? So it allows small farms to continue. But basically, what that means is that dairy products in Canada are significantly or can be significantly more expensive than in other countries. So you can't just produce as much as you want. Production is dropped, prices are higher. And the only way that that can truly work is if we put a very high duty at the border to prevent other countries from sending their milk here, because if not, that would blow up the whole supply management system. So milk and cheese at the border in Canada is about 300% duties.
What?
Okay?
300%?
Correct.
And we
Correct.
complain about Trump's 25%?
Yeah. So this system is really, again, geared to protect the Canadian farmers, particularly in the dairy space, but it also in poultry and other supply managed sectors. But the way that this works is right now there is a very, very high tariff on foreign products, which is why if you go to the grocery store and you want to buy these fancy cheeses, they cost a fortune, right? You're paying very high amounts for domestic and foreign cheese that are imported. And as part of these trade agreements, we have in the past sometimes allowed the foreign country to sell some small volume of foreign cheese without having to pay the 300% tariff. So under the EU agreement, we negotiated where we're providing some quota, basically some rights for EU producers to sell into Canada without having to pay the full 300% tariff. This system that Canada has, this supply management system, is a big problem for our trading partners. New Zealand has brought multiple challenges against Canada. The US has brought multiple challenges against Canada under international trade rules, and they're constantly trying to blow it up because they want to be able to sell cheese and milk and dairy products and poultry to Canada. And we've always refused. Again, the idea here, protect the farmers, allow, for proper revenue generation, even if it costs the Canadian consumers far more to buy milk or cheese than it might otherwise. So that's what the system is. It's effectively a system of controlled production, controlled pricing, and very high duties at the border. So if we're going to do more trade with the EU or with other countries that want access to our markets, a lot of folks are saying, well, the other countries are going to want some quid pro quo, and what they're going to want is more access to our supply managed sectors.
What are those sectors? So dairy, cheese, poultry. What other sectors do we have supply management in?
So there is so I mentioned poultry, turkey, eggs, and I'm missing a few
So
off the top.
primarily
Yeah,
farming products.
it's all farming products. Absolutely. Yeah.
And and why? So this is obviously a political issue. Have we ever had a national conversation on whether this actually makes sense to
It's
give
a
up the opportunities to enter into free trade agreements just to keep some farmers profitable?
so it's a very, very controversial issue in Canada. Um, Supply management is this sacred piece of legislation across the Canadian provinces and federally. And every time the federal government or provinces have even had inklings of changing the rules, protests have erupted. You know, the Canadian farmers and the groups will send their tractors and the like to Parliament Hill and protest. And these are very powerful organizations because they represent big parts of the Canadian economy and hundreds and thousands of farmers and jobs across the country.
So
So
yeah,
it's very, very difficult. Yeah.
we often hear about subsidies to farmers in Europe. Why is that different in Europe? Is it because it's a direct subsidy rather than supply management?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Agricultural subsidies in Europe are very high. They have been coming down over time. This is a different system altogether, and generally Canada has been pretty successful at carving it out of our trade agreements
So
and
if we
basically saying, go
so
ahead.
if we got rid of supply management, but somehow compensated those farmers through reduced taxes or direct subsidies, would that be allowed?
It would depend on what the deal says, right? If we're going to say when we enter into a deal saying you will respect our right to offer these subsidies to these farmers, then that might be an acceptable outcome. I think that this is a I certainly don't want to come off as having a position one way or another on this. This is a very politically sensitive topic, and just the threat of saying things like we need to overhaul our supply management sector is probably enough to get folks protesting
Yeah, no,
outside of your radio station.
I understand. I understand and agree, but I think the
Yeah.
problem is that we complain about Trump, and I think justifiably, but we got to look at ourselves. And if we've got these interprovincial trade barriers that are protecting car seats and first aid kits and supply management, and we have 300% tariffs on international products and 100% on Chinese EVs, we got to think about it. And whether we're to blame as much as others.
I think you're right, certainly on looking inward here and trying to use this kind of national crisis, frankly, to reflect on what we've been doing as a country. And if this is the impetus to knock some heads together and reduce, interprovincial barriers that frankly are sometimes accidents of history and just haven't been thought through properly, then this might be what it takes. So there are a number of others, right? We talked about, I used the example of the emergency first aid kits, but truckloads and truck tires, loads that can be carried by truckers are different across different provinces. And so a trucker can't necessarily move product from coast to coast. In fact, often cannot without meeting different requirements for different provinces. Some of those make sense, right? British Columbia has big mountains and driving a truck through those mountains requires certain stringency requirements. But if BC certifies the truck, then maybe we ought to allow it to move all the way to Nova Scotia without hitting different or needing different requirements across the country. And so that's a big one right there, is those kind of truckloads, truck tires, issues around interprovincial physical movement of goods across the country. there's a number of those other issues also.
William Pellerin, lawyer, trade lawyer, international trade lawyer, and expert at McMillan. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
We're going to take a final break, and I'm going to come back and give you a few concluding comments on what I think we need to do with this national emergency that William, I think, correctly says we're in, and really take a look at ourselves and how we can improve our own trading situation. Stay with us, everybody. Back in 2.